Great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Alvin, and this is Game Master's Guide. I'm Jonathan. I already said I'm Jonathan Alvin. Take two. I'm on a roll today already. We are going to be talking about the state of the art of the games industry, but we're going to be doing so in a little wider spectrum than I normally look at it. I'm going to be asking you to work with me to discover what exactly we should be seeing in the future, and are we ready for those changes? So as we get ready to do that, make sure you go down below and push all the buttons. Make sure that the algorithm knows that you're part of our audience, and we'll get started.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters, or the heat from a ball of flame, or strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Well, I'm clearly going to be clipping that header out of there. That was for yesterday's show. I'm such a professional at this, aren't I? So we are going to be talking about the paradigm of what the world is going on, and are we ready for what's coming? And for me, it started with Revelations. And when I say Revelations, of course, I'm not speaking of the biblical text. Instead, I'm referring to, because that isn't actually plural, that's actually Revelation of John. But this is actually an article that I did some time ago called Revelations for Now. In my early days as a writer, there were ideas coming at me fast and furious. And they were coming to me either through my dreams or daydreams or visions or whatever. And I started writing them down for my own purposes. And as I wrote them, I started to realize that we are moving towards inexorably something that I coined the term for long ago, the leisure economy. The idea of getting to a place where instead of looking at ourselves occupationally, we'd look at our lives recreationally. And so we wouldn't necessarily refer to ourselves as a writer or a publisher or a auto mechanic. We'd be describing ourselves as, well, I'm a role-play gamer, or I'm a board games guy, or I really like football, or whatever. And so the idea is that the identity of our personality would change over time. And as I proceeded from that Revelations for Now article and moved forward into blogging my dreams and such, and that site's still out there someplace in the void. But man, having fun with my throat today. It made me realize that we need to look at things in a much larger lens than we have in the past. And so today I'm going to be talking about some things that are a little bit edgy, and I am not making a judgment on either direction. Wow, I had a hard time saying that. So realize that I am presenting this information as the field of all possibilities and not necessarily a one-to-one correlation. And I'm trying to perhaps express some of my personal direction in reference to these items, and perhaps that will help to explain a bit about this channel, the decisions that I've made in the past and the things that I'm intending to go to in the future. But let's get started. Okay, so just in the very concept of looking at the leisure economy, in my past, I've been an air traffic controller, an avionics technician. I've worked on the SR-71 Blackbird. I've been a mover. I worked in warehouses. I've just done a whole ton of different types of occupations, each time pursuing it more for the dollars it would produce than the cents it would make. And the realization at some point in the past that I really am a creator and publisher and writer and all of those things came to fruition only by, if you will, foreshadow and foresight. There were things that were happening in my life that lent me the tools for achieving those goals. And although the comparison between, say, air traffic control and being a game designer or somebody who administers role-play games doesn't necessarily have a one-to-one seeming correlation. Nonetheless, the echoes of what would be in the future were already there in my present at the time. And so looking forward to the idea of the leisure economy, I had to start thinking about things in perhaps a different way. And one of the things that influenced that, if you will, were videos that I saw that were even back in those dark ancient days. There were video productions that touted the advancement of robotics and the advancement of artificial intelligence, and there were programs that you could purchase for your computer that would allow you to use some of the elements of that creativity relatively early, and I embraced the idea of using them without particularly considering what they would look like in the future. And of course, this idea of looking upon the tools with which we work and considering their value does put a different line of thinking when looking at them than perhaps somebody who does not actively work with those tools. This led me, of course, to some of the perceptions that I have and some of the directions that I've taken. So as a parent, one of the biggest challenges is the frustration that comes from working with an infant, a young person. As they grow older, they're still your children. They become increasingly frustrating because you feel like you need to convey information to them, and you try to inform their decisions so that they don't make foolish ones. And I bring this up mainly because I perceive of the way we as our culture has become as fundamentally trying to get angry with babies. And I'm referring, of course, to the concepts of artificial intelligence, whether you're looking at it from the graphics package and dealing with what images you're going to accept and how do you train the young. And to me, the idea of getting angry at babies really is reflective of I'm trying to figure out where my seat should be. It's reflective of how we perceive of the very information we provide. When we are parents and we are dealing with children who are obviously sentient beings, even though they may not understand yet, we have to find ways to teach them how to do what is the norm for a sane, sentient human being. We have to learn how to teach them how to walk, how to crawl, how to read, how to write, how to draw. And I perceive of the frustration that many artists in particular feel towards AI art in that basis, that they are looking at infantile scribblings. The difference is that, of course, the sophistication and the degree of emulation that an artificial intelligence can portray in its written form, which is, of course, argued against with plagiarism clauses, or graphics art packages where the question is whether or not they're actually stealing from the sources. And I feel it's like getting angry at babies because you are looking at a mechanized device. And yes, in the case of graphics art packages, many of them did, capture, if you will, the artwork of the ages, the great masters and the different culturated types of artwork, in order for the AI to be able to create on its own. They were grabbing infinitely larger and larger amounts of data to work with, and in the process of grabbing that data, and with the foibles that children have, the art producing software perhaps would steal. And the challenge with that, of course, is that when we're looking at it from a money-making process, it is a challenge, because if you are taking from if you were to, for example, steal a painting from a major museum and then proclaim it to be your own, or something like that, then there would be, yes, problems. But the issue here is that we're talking about art creation requires the student to work with copies of the great works that have gone before. The entire concepts of many college courses are to take children to the museum and let them see the great works, the great masters, and to even try their hand at emulating them. And that's not considered problematic, because it's in order to teach the student the concept of brushstrokes, the concept of all the difficult parts of art. And again, I talk about this in terms of being angry with babies, because if a child were to do an embellishment that was exactly like a great master in his work, we would almost be proud of him, because he's learning the processes. He's discovered the same things, perhaps, that the great masters had discovered in their youth, and therefore is providing validation for the learning process. But when you look at it from the standpoint of artificial intelligence, the biggest challenge is that art creation mechanism didn't have to do the work. It simply said, oh, you want something like that? I can make that. And the challenge with that, therefore, is no, that's not honoring to the artists. But of course, the software can't comprehend that. And even the people who are working with the software to create it are not looking at it from that perspective either. They're not. It's almost like expecting the student to learn only by the same mechanism that has been used to teach over time, but those therefore limit or restrict great new expressions of it. And we get to the point where the simplistic work of Jackson Pollock or whatever is considered to be genius, only because that was never a process that was used by somebody else, and therefore he's being avant-garde and creative because he's using a simplified system. Albeit if you had an infant that used the same art style as Jackson Pollock, you'd be, oh, this isn't art, this is a mess. And the issue therefore becomes what is being expressed in the art itself. And to me, the biggest challenge is that when we look forward to the art that's going to be coming down in the future, the artists of human nature will create the same way they've always created, and the AI's creations will emulate when they can, but they'll also be innovating only by clashing ideas together. And I find this interesting, because to me that is actually talking about the very nature of the way we educate, because we are to the point where we are teaching through imitation. So why shouldn't AI be learning by imitating? This is, of course, a difficult challenge, and you have to really wrestle with this on a minute-by-minute basis, whether or not you're going to be leaning into the development of artificial art, or are you going to be holding the line, in which case then there should never be arguably any art software. I mean, even the great modern creatives are utilizing more technology. I have friends who have done great pieces of art using their tablet and software that allows the brush strokes to be emulated from ink and oil paint onto an electronic canvas. And is that therefore wrong? Because if we're going to say that we have to stay within the mediums of which we're familiar, then of course there's always going to be stagnation and line drawing and such. This also applies to, for example, artificial intelligences like modern Chat 5, I think, is way more sophisticated than the originals and doesn't think the same way. But in the same fashion, children babble stuff they might have heard someplace else. So that you ask an AI software piece to write you a document and say 7% is determined to have been plagiarized from someplace, that is very akin to an infant who starts saying dirty words because he heard his Uncle Joe say it. So which do you want? Do you want a system that allows these children to get better? Or are you going to be drawing lines and saying, well, no, you can't participate that way. You have to learn the way we did. But the challenge is the way we learned is very much how they came to be what they are. So aren't they just derivative works already? So yes, it's problematic. I do believe that it's going to add more problems as we move towards the leisure economy, because if we embrace these new processes for creating information and creating data, we run the risks of allowing for hallucinations to occur within the documents. But again, isn't that like children who are working through the things that they see through the lens of what they have to work with? And so it becomes, again, problematic. Now, granted, when we were talking about the development of artificial intelligence and whether or not it fits on the Turing test, or whether you can determine whether or not it is AGI, has it yet reached that level of general intelligence that it fundamentally is akin to sentience? Who knows? But the point is that even if in the case of children, they have to learn in some fashion by emulating and copying, and we can't fault them if they happen to have perfect memory and record exactly what they saw, because there is no seeing, there are no eyes, there's no source other than the large language models that are being used. So I think that we need to realize that we're getting angry with babies, and this was actually even going forward into robotics, and we'll go into that in our next point. All right, so when we are looking, therefore, at the concept of developing intelligences, whether it be artificial intelligence through chat, artificial intelligence through, say, Midjourney or another of the art programs, or even in the case of robotics, the idea, therefore, is that we have to teach them the same way that we learned. And if that's really the argument, then the way that Boston Dynamics, for example, seems to treat their robots sort of ties into this, because they, you've seen the videos, I'm certain, where they are pushing the robots around and knocking them over and blocking their path and making them work through how to resolve it. And I consider this to be like poking the mirror. We're actually seeing the way our intelligence developed, and we're causing fundamentally evolution to occur electronically. We're trying to find ways to get the machines to be able to resolve any of those issues. Now, the scary part about that is that if we're talking about true AGI, true artificial intelligence, it will eventually outpace us simply because it has a more focused, defined utilization. We as human beings have a million different skills, million different possibilities in our lives, and therefore we have a much less targetable intellect. Whereas in the case of, if you're building a robot simply to maneuver through the world, then you are building something that is going to operate and function differently than we do, and has to learn the same fundamental mechanisms, but they're not going to learn in the same fashion. And so, yes, the idea of having a person assigned to knock the robot dog or whatever off course, or block its doorway, or whatever, these are all things that we have to have in order to guide those intelligences to the extent that we can. But we have to realize also that with poking the mirror like that, we actually are fundamentally also poking the bear. I'm reminded of the horrible videos of the past where I'm talking, black and white movie recordings that were made, motion pictures and films that were made of the way people treated people. If you want to talk about the period of the Holocaust, if you want to talk even further back with the very first images of people that were slaveholders, this idea of inhumane treatment we see now through the lens of how that's tacitly wrong. But won't we see in another 20 years or 30 years when AGI does develop, us having to explain why pushing those robots around, those Boston Dynamics imbeciles, fundamentally, they're not yet knowledgeable enough to know how to resolve the conflicts, and so therefore they're having to just deal with them. Aren't we going to see those in the same context down the road? Now, it terrifies me to think that we would see that way, because that would be anthropomorphizing the machine far beyond the extent of their capacities to be like us. They are still, after all, at this point, programming artifacts. But I wonder if it's going to be down the road, and maybe I'm doing this from the standpoint of, like I did with Revelations, maybe I'm referring to these things in terms of what we will see in the future rather than what we actually have today. But I wonder at the concept of poking the mirror, poking the machine in the same way that we ourselves were poked in the past and prodded and guided and insulted and such, simply because it hasn't emerged yet. These are questions I think that we really need to kind of focus on going forward. Pardon me. As my grandfather would say, I said all of that to say this. I do believe that we need to have a change in our paradigm going forward if we want to endure, exist, and survive, and even thrive in this new environment where the artificial intelligences achieve what we're attempting to provide them with. And that is to see ourselves in ways that are not tied to our occupation, because occupationally we are fundamentally building, if you will, replacements. The idea of getting an AGI to want to support the concept of cleaning up after us and taking out the trash and driving our cars, etc., 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 really requires us to change as well, because we have to be more compassionate with those that are our servants. And I don't mean servants in the old deprecating dark way. I'm referring to the machines that are built specifically for those purposes. Now, that means we need to think differently. We need to actually change paradigm. As you may know, paradigm is a word that refers to the frame of reference from which we see things. And changing that literally means looking at it with another pair of eyes. And the idea here is that we have to look at where we are in the world, not from the standpoint of an occupation as far as what work we do, but what we are and who we are. And one of the ways we can do that is through the concept of our play environment. What do we prefer? There are people who are moviegoers. There are people who are stadium goers for sporting events. There are people who really like to dance. All of these different concepts they're drawn to the fore when we no longer have to focus on what we've done as our work in the past. And I'm kind of doing this video fundamentally as a propagation of my original Revelations for Now concept, that we are changing. The world is changing, and I'm not presenting myself as a prophet per se, but I am saying that I've seen this coming for a while, and in this generation, in this iteration of our culture, we are kind of losing our focus and instead figuring out what to point at and blame for the challenges that we have, instead of thinking imaginatively and trying to grab a hold of what that future will be and embrace it. And I think that's the change that we need to see. Because if we can make that change now, then as those advances occur, they will be not only accepted, but they will be embraced. And I think that will put us in a better stead than the current process. I want to thank you for being here for today. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is Nikos RPG, and this has been Game Master's Guide. I'll see you next